power. All that is documented. Do we regard this terror as terror? Do we regard the siege of Fallujah in Iraq as terror, in which thousands were killed and maimed in an utterly pointless attack? Do we regard as terror the enforced starvation of Gaza? Do we regard daily threats against the 17 million people of Iran as terror? The American reporter Seymour Hersh described the other day how the White House was trying to provoke Iran into defending itself. One idea of Vice President Cheney was to build a fleet of PT boats like the ones the Iranian Navy has, put Americans in them dressed as Iranian sailors, and let them start a shoot-up with American ships. That should do it, said Cheney. Fortunately, it was pointed out to the Vice President that this would mean Americans killing Americans, and his plan was rejected. Hersh says his magazine, The New Yorker, refuses to publish this important story of black farce. That's how censorship works, by omission. Last November, the National Intelligence Estimate, representing the 16 US intelligence agencies, published a report on Iran. We judge with high confidence, said the report, that in fall 2003, Tehran halted its nuclear weapons program, unquote. Yet turn on the radio or TV, pick up a newspaper, and it's as if this inconvenient truth did not exist. The drumbeat has started. Iraq déjà vu. War by journalism. Afghanistan is promoted as a good war. In fact, it's a very bad war. A PR exercise to make Americans feel better after 9/11 and to cover the fact that Osama bin Laden had got away. The cost of this stunt was, according to an investigation by the London Guardian, 20,000 innocent lives. There's also the matter of the strategic control of the energy-rich Caucasus, but that's rarely mentioned. The news is that the good war is drawing the line against evil. There's no human enemy, no national resistance, only something called the Taliban. The Taliban are bad. We are good. Australian diggers are heroes, yet again. That's the story. But what exactly are we and our allies doing in Afghanistan? On the day I wrote these words, American planes had slaughtered yet another wedding party, 47 people, mostly women and children. Wedding parties are a specialty of our side. So far, we've bombed to bits 4 of them. To many of us on this cosy Melbourne night, that didn't happen. Nothing ever happened, to quote Harold Pinter, of crimes committed in our name. Even while it was happening, it wasn't happening. It didn't matter. It was of no interest. Last year, 26,000 troops, mostly Americans, invaded the beautiful, fragile landscape around Shoalwater Bay in Queensland. Stealth aircraft bombed, and the US 7th Fleet fired live missiles and exploded depth charges in areas where endangered species live. Indeed, they blasted away some of the most amazing biodiversity in Australia. This week we've had copious media on the plight of a baby whale, but we've heard nothing about the high-frequency devastation of the sonar of countless whales during this military exercise, and it was the biggest military exercise in Australia since the Second World War. We heard nothing about it. It didn't happen. It didn't happen even when it was happening. It was of no interest. Last February, Kevin Rudd apologised to the Aboriginal people. What rejoicing there was. A tsunami of sentiment flowed from the country's political and cultural elite. I spotted one nugget of truth. A Sydney Morning Herald editorial said, and I quote, "The Rudd government has moved quickly to clear away this piece of political wreckage in a way that responds to some of its supporters' emotional needs, yet it changes nothing. It's a shrewd manoeuvre, unquote. What has changed? In 2006, the ABC's current affairs programme, Lateline, broadcast lurid allegations of organised paedophile rings of sex slavery among the Mutijulu people. The programme's source, described as an anonymous youth worker, was later exposed as a federal government official, indeed an assistant secretary working in Mal Bruff's Aboriginal Affairs Department in Canberra. Bruff himself told Lateline, "Everybody knows who runs the paedophile rings." The latest media war on the Aboriginal people was well underway. Even though Bruff withdrew his comment, even though the Northern Territory Chief Minister denied the Lateline allegations, and the police denied them too. But the symbiosis between media and government was such that John Howard was able to declare what he called a national emergency and send in the army and business managers into Aboriginal communities in the north. Did Howard really care about black children whose basic rights he had steadfastly opposed since the day he came to office? Or was there another agenda? What was reported, hardly at all, was that the government was clawing back Aboriginal land rights in the only part of Australia where they exist comprehensively. The Northern Territory contains extraordinary mineral wealth, including huge deposits of uranium on Aboriginal land. Under Howard, the number of companies licensed to explore for uranium doubled to 80. At the same time, the government spent millions appropriating Aboriginal land for the dumping of toxic waste. The Northern Territory borders the Arafura and Timor Seas and their oil and gas riches. Last month, a truth emerged quietly, unobtrusively. Of the 7,433 Aboriginal children examined as part of the so-called intervention, 39 have been referred to the authorities for suspected abuse. And of those 39 cases, a maximum 4 possible abuses were identified. Let me repeat that. 4 out of almost 7,500. There was no sex slavery, and the emergency was the same old poverty and despair and denial of resources for health, education, you name it. Lateline has neither retracted or apologised. Such are the rules of war by journalism. And under Kevin Rudd, the intervention continues. What's more, Rudd's Indigenous Affairs Minister, Jenny Mackie, now threatens to withdraw support from remote Aboriginal communities that are, she says, wait for it, economically unviable. What is it about the Aboriginal story that leaves so many Australians so bereft of decent behaviour and so eager to believe the old myths? To my knowledge, only 2 journalists, Deborah Jopson and Joel Gibson of the Sydney Morning Herald, have exposed the fact that hundreds of millions of dollars, which the federal government claims it spends on Indigenous affairs, have never been spent, or have been used to benefit whites, or have gone into actually opposing native title claims. You take one region, Thamara, in the Northern Territory, and I'm quoting a recent ANU study, less than $5,000 is spent on every school-aged child in that Aboriginal region. That's less than half the amount spent on children throughout the Territory, less than half. So much for the bottomless pit of Aboriginal welfare. Why do we allow such myths? What have we got to hide? Perhaps we know, deep down as they say, that the paradise we promote all over the world still doesn't quite belong to us. A hero of mine is Edward Smith Hall. I would make his story obligatory in all media courses. In 1826, Hall launched his weekly 8-page, 8-penny newspaper, the Sydney Monitor. On the front page, in large type, was a definition of a journalist, and I quote, "an inveterate opposer rather than a staunch parasite of government," unquote. I like that. The colony of New South Wales was then effectively a British military dictatorship. Governor Darling, I think, was in charge. Hall was having none of it. He exposed corruption and malfeasance, and he demanded democracy on behalf of his readers. He refused to befriend any politician. He was often in jail pending trial for criminal defamation, which was then the favourite device for suppressing unpalatable truth. Perhaps more than anyone, this little-known journalist planted the seeds of 3 basic liberties in Australia: freedom of the press, representative government, and trial by jury. So what happened then? Well, another kind of journalism arrived with advertising, and the Edward Smith Halls were declared obsolete, or they were shunted into the margins as not really one of us. To attract big advertisers, the new corporate press formed close alliances with the establishment. In America, the first schools of journalism were set up with pretensions of respectability that matched their corporate endowments, and the myth of objective neutrality was spun around the so-called professional journalist. What the public didn't know was that in order to be professional, journalists were trained, perhaps groomed is a better word, to ensure that news and opinion was in effect validated and dominated by official sources. Take almost any major Australian newspaper today. Check the sources of the main political stories, domestic and foreign, and you'll find they're dominated by government and established interests. That's the essence of what's called impartial, objective journalism. Now, this is not to suggest, and I must emphasise this, that independent journalism is excluded, but it's the honourable exceptions. So what can be done? Well, first, we should begin, I think, to recognise the gatekeepers, those who guard the spaces of public debate and see off dissent. A few examples. In this morning's Age, Michael Gowenda, a former editor of that newspaper, mounts a disgraceful attack on Nick Davies, the distinguished Guardian journalist and a guest at this festival. Always snide, Gowenda calls into question Davies' integrity. Why? Because Davies has written an extraordinary book and has dared to break the silence about how journalism works. One of the sponsors of this festival is the liberal-minded magazine The Monthly. A recent issue devoted 10 pages to a character assassination of the Australian maverick journalist Wilfred Burchett, the reporter who was first to expose the horror of Hiroshima. What was extraordinary about this 10-page assault was that Burchett has been dead for 23 years. The article was an especially Australian blend of hearsay, smear, and omission. A key part of this type of work is the destruction of reputation, rather than a reasoned critique of issues that should concern us all. The author of the Burchett attack was Robert Mann, who happens to be chairman of the board of The Monthly. Mann is a former editor of Quadrant, an influential magazine